Mr. Chalmers, for a journalist to work in Reuters probably sounds still kind of big realization. You have worked in Reuters in the 90s and in the beginning of the 21st century. So why did you left Reuters?
The short answer to that is that I couldn't do the journalism that I wanted to do. And that was because Reuters wasn't interested, as far as my experience of making suggestions to my editors was concerned. They didn't want to do the sort of journalism that I thought was necessary.
And what about the long answer?
So the longer answer is that I had, by that time, written about global negotiations on climate change. I'd written about global negotiations on trade. I'd written about financial markets, and particularly the London stock market, but also global commodity markets, including the gold market. And in each of those sectors, I wrote about many other subjects as well, but in each of those sectors that I just mentioned, there were problems, as far as I could see, with the way that decisions were taken regarding those sectors. And I was starting to put questions to myself, which is, the decision-making processes go back to democracy. So I was asking myself the question, what is democracy? I was finding myself wanting to go to speak to anti-globalization protesters. So people that in France are called altermondialistes, in English, anti-globalization, which is not a title I like because I don't actually think it's accurate. They were people who were unhappy with global capitalism and the way global capitalism was working. So they were the sort of people who were the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico. They were the sort of people who were protesting on the streets in Seattle against a new world round of global trade talks. They were the sort of people who were protesting about the lack of activity on sorting out global climate change and doing things politically about climate change. They were the sort of people who were complaining about the power of international financial markets over sovereign countries, so the governments of sovereign countries. So they were all these different people, and I, as a journalist at Reuters, was talking to my editors and saying, I think we need to cover these people better. We need to do a better job of getting the overall picture of what's going on with regard to globalization. And it was various different forms that I proposed it, and I didn't get anywhere. And after suggesting it in different ways, in different even places, because it started in Malaysia, I think, when I actively started proposing these ideas, I decided that I would be better off to leave the company and try to, first of all, understand better why my dream job wasn't a dream job, and then maybe think about how I could do that.
So eventually you become the author of the book Fraudcast News, How Bad Journalism Supports Our Bogus Democracies, and also you start supporting making a blog called Fraudcast News. Are you to what extent these project of yours are your answer or your solution to the problems you have come across while working in Reuters or in other media?
To what extent are those solutions to the problems I've come across? I would say very initial solutions. They're more like my own self-examination and research as to what was the nature of the problem. So what I found, and in the book title, Fraudcast News, How Bad Journalism Supports Our Bogus Democracies. So the bad journalism element was, in a way, not only a criticism of my profession, which is journalism, and it still is my profession, It was also a criticism of my own personal journalism. So my lack of political depth, I would say. So I am pretty self-critical as to how politically ignorant I was as a practicing journalist. And I was ignorant of the problems of journalism, and I was ignorant of the realities of politics. So the book and the blog that you mentioned were more like an ongoing process of examination of why I ended up getting frustrated and why I left what from the outside looked to me like a dream journalism job, which is to be foreign correspondent with Reuters.
So eventually at this moment I understand that you develop a project about promotion of journalism as a way to strengthen democracy. Could you tell us something more about this project, which I understand also focuses on certain democratic innovations? So you could also possibly also tell something more about these innovations you research.
So with pleasure, Vladimir. I concluded from the book that journalists were not doing a good job. And I concluded in the book that what we call very unthinkingly democracy is not democracy at all. So if you use the Greek definitions of political structures, we live what we loosely call democracy, which actually then, if you dig into it, is representative democracy. So democracy means government by the people. Representative democracy means that you have elections periodically and you send people to represent you to run the government and take public decisions on your behalf. Neither of those is what we intuitively understand as democracy, which is sort of power in the hands of the people. So already from a linguistic point of view, I understood from my research and writing the book that the word democracy should always be used with quote marks around it. Because the Greeks, when they invented it, demos kratos, meant government by the people. And so a more accurate way of describing our systems of government, I think personally, is to use the Greek word something like oligarchy. So that is power in the hands of a few, an elite few. So the elite few are running the political system on behalf of the elite few, rather than on behalf of the whole of society. And this is Aristotle who gave these terms, democracy, oligarchy, tyranny, monarchy, aristocracy. These are terms that Aristotle used 2,500 years ago. So I went back to first principles, definitions of democracy, and I said, do we live in a democracy? And what is a democracy? And all that work led me to have a health warning for me with the word democracy. I do not personally think we live in democracies. I'm British, and I live in France. I don't think either the United Kingdom or France can truly claim to be democracies, i.e. that their societies, their people, have a significant amount of influence on the public decision-making process. I think it would be far more accurate to talk about them as oligarchies. So that's where I start, which I realize is quite, in terms of conventional people, that's quite a sort of inverted commas radical thing to say. But my training, my university degree was in engineering. So what I never practiced as an engineer, but what engineers do is if something isn't working, like a car, they lift the bonnet on the car and they look at the engine and they say, why is it not working? And so with me, I was looking at our political systems and saying, this is called democracy. Why isn't it working? First of all, I looked at the definition of democracy, and then I started looking under the bonnet, or the hood, as the Americans would say, and I was asking myself, what is not working? So first of all, it's not just democracy that we're talking about as far as the ancient Greeks were concerned. It's representative democracy. You can look up the definition of representative democracy. You've got American academics like Samuel Huntington who talk about, who give a definition of representative democracy as meaning periodic, free and fair elections. The idea that anyone can stand as a candidate in terms of eligible adults, and also the existence of freedoms to publish, freedoms to speak, freedoms to assemble, which means to gather on the public square, and freedom to organize, so to have a political party or a trade union or a political movement of some sort. So representative democracy, it's got this cute word democracy in it, and that draws on what we think of as a nice thing, but actually in reality it's not government by the people, it's like government by these representatives. And then you start going into this question, well, what does it really mean to have people represent you and be periodically elected? You go back to the ancient Greeks and they used lotteries. They didn't use elections. Very, very few Greek offices in the Greek city-states in ancient Greece used elections. They talked about elections as being aristocratic. So they would favor candidates who were beautiful, who could speak well, who were well-educated, who were rich. They would be the most likely people to get elected. Sounds familiar today, let's face it. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that elections favor those sorts of people versus lottery or sortition, as it's called by the academics, which favors a much more representative sample of the eligible population. So I did this long process, and frankly it was quite difficult, and I was sort of more stupid than I realized, to go through the definitions of democracy and political systems and try to work out where the problems were. So that's a long answer, Vladimir, and there's a little bit extra to it, which is having made this diagnosis of, as it were, the pathology of our political systems, I then thought, okay, so I love journalism and I want to be a journalist. So what should I do now that I've done this analysis? And my conclusion is to look for examples of something which isn't representative democracy. So there are experiments going on around the world using lotteries. And I have plans over the next year and a half through until probably late 2018 maybe, or early 2019, to go to different places around the world to do short video films and print articles to look at experiments, or even real life experiments with real public decisions where lotteries are being used. And the idea is to say to the people running them, why are you doing them? How do you think this works better than elections, or a process that would have involved elections? And could we use what you're doing here in other parts of the world? And my own personal conviction, because I realize that we journalists are human beings, so we are subjective like everyone else. There's no such thing as objectivity, so I declare mine in advance. My sense is that lotteries are better than elections. I want to go out as a journalist and examine that idea, and really that's the idea of the project.
So my thought is going into two directions simultaneously. I will try to follow them one by one. First of all, do you think that people are always right, even when, for example, when they vote for Trump or they support Brexit? Is the people always right?
It's a very good question. I'm not going to even answer that question because I'm not going to dodge it either, Vladimir. The process of voting, either in an election or in a referendum. So Trump was an election and Brexit was a referendum. Those two examples that you throw at me are what the political scientists will call an undeliberated decision. And what do I mean by undeliberated? It means that there is not the opportunity to gather together provable facts, or at least dependable information. There is not the opportunity to talk to other people in your society about their points of view in order to come towards some sort of consensus opinion as to what might be a sensible course of action. So a referendum like Brexit, or an election like the presidential elections that have just finished, those are undeliberated political processes. And if you have a process like that, then it means that the effects of money, for example, can push the decision in one direction or another direction, and the effects of media, and that's media which is in the hands either of rich individuals or which is subject to the pressures of advertisers, then that has a huge effect on the way people vote. So in the United States, the last presidential cycle, I think they collectively spent something like 6.5 or 6.7 billion US dollars. I got that figure this week from a site called Open Secrets, and that's an estimate of how much money the presidential cycle cost in terms of spending on candidates and political actions. 6.7 billion, and obviously that is a lot of money, and it comes from somewhere, and I'm from Scotland. We have a reputation for being very careful with our money, but people don't spend their money stupidly on the whole. They think they're getting something for their money. So $6.7 billion there wants a result. And same in the Brexit vote, not the same amount of money, but there was big amounts of money on both sides, and there was also very biased and inaccurate media. So what you get from the people who vote is an attempt to make sense of something which makes no sense, because there's no opportunity to establish proper facts, there's no opportunity to deliberate, there's very little trustworthy debate that goes on. It's a very, what the British call a Punch and Judy show, where you have those puppets which punch each other and children laugh at them like sort of clowns in a circus. You have that sort of politics that goes on, and it's no wonder that people decide to just switch off their televisions and not even vote, because what they're seeing is sort of the sort of stuff that you would have hoped to have left behind at school in the playground.
Okay, but so there are once again two questions possibly. First of all, I understand. Do I understand correctly that only a certain enlightened society of people or group of people or society of people can withstand the big financial and the business interests? And on the other hand, I wonder if all these democratic innovations appear to be local, if I'm not mistaken. At least that's the impression I got from an article by you I read in The Guardian. Is the battle lost for democracy lost at a national and supranational level, and so that it could be there could be victory only at a local level?
Okay, so answering the last bit first.
Yes.
My answer to that specifically, can it only happen at the local level? My answer is no, but that's probably where things have to start. Mm-hmm. So when I'm looking at questions of democracy and questions of political systems, I stretch the timeline. So democracy, the word, not even the idea, because it goes back further, but democracy, the word, is about 2,500 years old. And you and I, Vladimir, will probably not live 100 years. So that's a long human life. But so we have to be patient. This, for me, this is the start of a big change that's coming through. If you look at many of the Western representative democracies around the world, there is a deep, deep sense of dissatisfaction. So I live in France, and there has just been a presidential election, and there are a lot of unhappy people. The second round of the presidential election was Macron versus Le Pen, and there was a French commentator who described that option as choosing between Uber, the taxi company, or Hitler. So on the one hand you have neoliberalism, and on the other hand you have some form of fascist. So does it have to be local? No, but at the moment it's more likely to be local, because that's where you can have experiments taking place off the radar, and where people can establish working practices and proof of concept. So that's the first part of your question.
Yes.
You talked about, is it only for the enlightened to resist the media? No, is my answer to that. I am an optimist, that's my nature, And I think that human beings, regardless even of their background and education and the rest, I think are fundamentally wise. I think we have wisdom, all of us. I think there are circumstances which make us more or less stupid, rather than us being innately wise or stupid. So if you, and as I do, believe in deeper democracy, then part of that process is to trust the intelligence of the humans around you, and to accept your own positive characteristics and your own negative characteristics. That's fine, that's all of us. But to see the same in other people, so to make allowances for your own stupidity and the stupidity of your neighbors, but also your own intelligence and the intelligence of your neighbors. So it has to be a process of trust. And that comes locally as well, because you can meet people and you can establish relationships and do that. And then maybe I didn't answer your previous question exactly right, which is, or completely, which is, are the people right? Really the point there with Brexit and with Trump is that I personally, I'm not going to condemn a fellow voter for voting Brexit or voting in the UK Remain. So it was Brexit or to leave the European Union, or Remain to stay in the European Union. There are legitimate arguments on both sides. And frankly, in Trump versus Hillary Clinton, I am not going to condemn someone who votes Hillary Clinton or votes Donald Trump. The people I will aim at as a journalist, the people I will criticize, are the politicians seeking elected office, because often they know exactly what they're doing. When Trump talks about Mexicans as rapists and all the rest, he knows exactly what he's doing. So I would condemn Donald Trump, but I would not condemn people necessarily who vote for Donald Trump. I would talk to them and I would look for better systems to encourage dialogue.
You mentioned France, and I was astonished to learn that there were 4 million ballots who were made voluntary, not voluntary, but intentionally invalid. I'm not sure whether you got this news. So just to end this topic, are you aware of certain democracy innovations or searches among the French people, especially in this moment, at this moment of the elections and so on?
I wouldn't claim to be an expert, because I'm not. That's the reality. Whilst we're talking, Vladimir, I've pulled up a graphic from France 24, you know, one of the French media. Yeah. And so there you've got abstention of 25.44%. So, you know, that's a quarter of the population didn't vote. And then you've got spoiled is another 3%, and blank is another 8.49%. So I don't know. I'm doing this live, so I can't exactly give you details.
It's not necessary to comment on
spoiled votes. I mean,
yes. It's not necessary to comment on this fact. I just give it as a context. What matters is the searches of if French people also search for alternatives, not only within the party system, which the current system, but in other forms.
I would say that yes, they definitely are. I mean, one of the candidates was Mélenchon, and he was proposing a system of random selection for his constitutional reform process. And frankly, I didn't go into detail in any of the programs of any of the candidates, because I'm not a big fan of elections personally, and I don't have a vote in the French presidential elections. And France is just one country in all of the countries of the world. It just happens to be the place I live. So I didn't follow in detail the programs of the candidates. That's the reality. But I do know that political innovation is a live topic in France. There is a lot of dissatisfaction with conventional politics, and a lot of people are looking for alternatives.
Okay, now I would like to move the talk towards the second pillar of your search is journalism more.
Yeah.
you have the experience of working also with left-wing media. At least I got the impression you have worked for some time at Z Magazine in the USA. I also notice you talk about indie media and undercurrents, which were famous media of the outer globalist movement, if I'm not mistaken. But I haven't heard anything about or from them for quite a long time. So I remember that when the outer globalist movement was on the rise, the left people and the left media used to attack the notion that there is no alternative. They were searching for alternatives. And now, a certain number of years later, what is the alternative that the left media in the USA or UK or France offer?
So the first part, Vladimir, is going through those three names that you mentioned. So Z Magazine. I never worked for Z Magazine. I did do something or other, a week-long training with the Z Media Institute in, I think it was 2005. So I went there and had a very valuable week learning about media critique, I suppose. So I came from the very conventional media, which is Reuters, and I went to a more radical and critical media organization and took part in the event with several dozen other people. So I didn't work for Z Media, but I did go on one of their very valuable training courses, and that was an excellent learning exercise for me. For indie media, which you mentioned, I couldn't claim to have done very much for indie media at all. So specifically, I once reported for indie media when I was in Copenhagen in 2009 at the Conference of the Parties, the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen. And I talk about that in the book when I, as a journalist, took part in a civil disobedience protest, and I got sort of pepper sprayed and thumped with by the police along with the other people who were there. And I did that as an exercise in what is it like to do civil disobedience, given that my sense at that stage was politics and journalism are broken, so I can understand why people undertake acts of civil disobedience. So what is it like and who does it? So I went and did it myself to investigate it. So that was when I did a tiny bit of work for Indomedia. I actually reported from the protest that I was taking part in for Indomedia. And with Undercurrents, I worked with people who were very much involved with Undercurrents in London when I was there in 2011, 2012, for personal reasons for sort of 9 months. I did some work with an organization called Vision on TV, and they are a group of people who are exploring how to build alternative media. And the reality is, as my conclusion, is that it's bloody difficult. There's all sorts of barriers to success, and it's not easy. So where I sit at the moment is looking at something called variously solutions journalism or constructive journalism or positive journalism. And the idea of all those three versions of what ultimately is the same thing is that you don't, as a reporter, just go and criticize a problem or highlight a problem. You go there and you say, okay, there is this problem, and in fact, maybe even these people are to blame, but surely there are some solutions. And in a way, my project of 9 short films and documentary is a solutions journalism project. And the problem is representative democracy. As far as I'm concerned, it is broken and like some sort of walking zombie, soon to fall over. And a possible solution could be something like lottery-based public decision-making mechanisms. So it's a solutions journalism approach to there is a huge problem. I'm not just going to criticize it and say that they're all rubbish. I'm going to say this doesn't work. It's a systems problem. It's not a person problem. And there are other systems that are being experimented with to try and take public decisions in a much fairer and more just and environmentally wise way.
So, talking about journalism, sometimes what WikiLeaks does, or what Edward Snowden has done, are interpreted as a sign of something new in journalism. But what's your take on these their revelations? Did they change the world, really?
So Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, definitely they changed the world. I would put both of them into the category of investigative journalism. So they revealed to the world information that we didn't previously know, and they allowed us some certainties in areas that before had just been sort of rumors, particularly with regard to techniques of mass surveillance. So with Edward Snowden, when I was moving amongst various different activist circles, people would talk about taking the battery out of their mobile phones so as not to be spied on, not to have their conversations listened to remotely, or to have cameras activated remotely, or recording devices activated remotely. They talked about that, and there were sort of various different responses from, you're bonkers, or you're paranoid, or don't be so ridiculous, to, okay, I'll take the battery out. But Edward Snowden, if he did nothing else, and he did much, much more, he made us realize that all of those stories about surveillance were as bad, in fact, they were much worse than we realized. So Edward Snowden definitely had a journalistic effect, and that journalist effect was sort of amplified via journalists. So people like Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, and Glenn Greenwald, the journalist based in Brazil. So he is most certainly a journalist. Julian Assange, he's even if as a human being, he's for me quite a confusing character. That's not the point. I mean, even if it were just one of the WikiLeaks elements, which was the collateral murder one, which was the gun site video from Iraq of various different Iraqis basically being shot in cold blood. It actually turned out that there were some journalists amongst them, so it got much, much more coverage. But you had the soundtrack of the US soldiers and helicopter pilots shooting in cold blood, effectively, Iraqis, and also people covering the conflict. That, even if it were just for that, was a role of investigative journalism. So there's this sort of blurring between people who would be conventionally journalists in the past and people who are doing journalistic behavior. And then there are other people around the world who are doing very high quality investigative journalism. And I think that's great. But my problem with all of it is that we are sort of beyond shock. Things are so bad in terms of the behavior of some of our elected leaders that almost we are beyond parody. And so the stand-up comedians are almost running out of material because the politicians themselves are so ridiculous and so shockingly misbehaving that we don't need satire almost to portray them in the light that we can all see. So my problem with investigative journalism is that the political structures no longer respond to the revelations. So people don't resign. I wonder if Richard Nixon was in power today, whether he would have to leave office because of the revelations of Watergate. So that's why I, as a journalist, I'm thinking, I'm not going to do investigative journalism because the problem is our political structures. It's not that we don't know what's going on. We do know what's going on, but our political structures are such that you can stay in office almost whatever you've done.
So do you worry that in a certain way power has become unchangeable and also a kind of has entered automatic mode. So journalism no longer is able to shatter the status quo, even if the revelations of the scale of WikiLeaks or Snowden.
So I'm not frightened. No, I'm not, and I'm not pessimistic about the potential power of journalism. But my own personal focus is to focus on system change. So to first of all, as a good journalist, you investigate and you analyze the subject that you want to cover. And for me, in a way, it's the state of our political structures, or the reality of our political structures, is something that you would say is hidden in plain sight. I.e., if you choose to go and look for it, it's there in any textbook that you care to dig through. All of the pieces are there. But what is not there at the moment is this idea that we can say our entire system of Western representative democracy is pretty much dead on its feet. So we have, and I'm so glad that we have them, and that's why we're talking today, Vladimir. We have freedoms. We still have freedoms. So we have freedoms to speak to an extent. We have freedoms to publish to an extent. We have freedoms to assemble and to organize to an extent. But they're compromised. And also, I would say they're under threat. But we still have those things. And we can analyze the structures of our governments, and we can say, as journalists, they are broken. They are broken, and we need much better ones for social justice reasons, for environmental reasons, to try to prevent conflict, to do any number of the good things that we can do in our lives. We need to change our political systems. So I'm not going to say, okay, Winston Churchill, that famous Britain wartime leader, he's got this quote which is classic Churchill, which is sort of clever and funny, but it's very unsatisfactory for me, which is that he talks about democracy as the best system, or the least worst system, bar all the other systems that have been tried from time to time. It's something like that, the quote. I haven't quoted it exactly right, but it's like a joke. It's a very British way of saying, yeah, democracy's crap, but everything is even more crap, so we're just going to have to stay with democracy. For me, I say, sorry, Winston, you haven't even told me what democracy means, so I'm not even going to play with your little quote. I'm going to go and say, okay, it's not actually democracy anyway, and I'm going to say, what could democracy be?
So finally, I will derive my last question from an article you wrote in 2012 for Guardian, where you make a plea to people or ask them to develop their economic culture by way of reading some non-conventional sources. So this is not. This is just as a context of the question, but your plea is very, once again, just as the whole interview, very optimistic. So as a final, I would like to ask you, what makes you to be such an optimist for people's ability to overcome manipulation, to overcome the powerful political and business interests, and also to self-organize and live free?
I suppose it's a choice. It's a real conscious choice. I'm very aware that we could easily choose cynicism. We could easily choose pessimism. And for me, I choose optimism. And I do that for very sort of pragmatic reasons. And for a start, life is much happier if you choose the optimistic path. And I think, I could just as easily say I choose pessimism because all around me is black and dark. But even just pragmatically, I think, Bernie Sanders on Trump, he said, despair is not an option. I.e., cynicism and pessimism is the easy way out. So I would say to those people, sure, choose that route if you want, but I refuse myself to give up. Because despair and pessimism, who wants to go and spend time with despairing people and pessimistic people as partners in some sort of constructive process of building other structures? You know, it's fine to be despairing, it's fine to be pessimistic. If that's what people choose, that's for them. I do not choose that because I don't think it's possible to build anything worthwhile from those places. You can do some analysis there, you can do some examination there, but it's not going to help you build something. And so I choose very knowingly optimism. It's more fun, and I'm far more likely to find creative, interesting solutions that could potentially work from a place of optimism. And that's why I'm going to look around the world at these little sort of tiny little islands of success and hope, and also pragmatic construction, because it's very, very easy to be rude about the political leaders, to say, you know, we've got no hope, nothing can ever get done, and you just give up and you drink beer or you take drugs or you just watch stupid television programs. You know, you just check out. I'm not interested in checking out. I think there's much more fun to be done building stuff.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much.